Alright guys, welcome back to my YouTube channel. Recently I've been getting into SIM tools and specifically Splunk Enterprise I got in my home lab environment, 60 days free, it's pretty cool. And for those of you that don't know, in pretty much every Windows computer there's something called an event viewer. And this, these are thousands of logs of things happening within the computer. You've got security logs, system logs, application logs. And if you have thousands of logs on every device and you've got hundreds of devices, it can be really challenging to kind of collect these logs and understand what's happening in your environment. And that's where Splunk comes into play and makes this super easy because you can query search, create dashboards, just make managing the logs a lot easier. And today I wanted to simulate a cyber attack on my home lab from Kali Linux and then figure out exactly what happened by creating a dashboard report in Splunk. So let me move over to Kali Linux. Okay, now over on Kali Linux, essentially what I want to do with this attack is get on my domain controller in my home lab. And actually I have 3 machines in my home lab. I've got a domain controller, a component server, and a workstation computer. And they're all in the same network, and this attacker has access to that network as well. This machine's on the same network. And the goal is to get on the domain controller and to add a backdoor account to establish persistence. So if you're an attacker, what you might first want to do is figure out all of the devices that are on the network that you're on. So you can do sudo net discover. And this will show all the IPs that are on the network that you're on. And if our goal is to get to the domain controller, we need to figure out which one of these IPs is the domain controller. And you can kind of get a sense for that if you run nmap and then see, given the ports that are open, which one of these is most likely to be a domain controller. And already this .100, these ports that are open are pretty indicative of this being a domain controller. So we'll keep that in mind for later. Now next up, the attacker is going to want to get initial access, and this is usually done through any kind of credentials. This can be done through phishing, but what I'm going to do is set up a network listener called responder. To do that, we'll do sudo responder. It's going to listen over Ethernet. Click enter. So we've set up this listener on the network, and essentially what responder does is it steals hashes of users trying to resolve names that don't exist on the network. An example of what that looks like is if we go over to the Windows workstation in our environment, log on as a user, and then if we try to access something in the network that doesn't exist, like this file path, it'll give us this pop-up, but we don't even need to enter our credentials, because if we go back to the listener, right here it got the IP that it stole credentials from, it's got the username, and it's got this NTLM v2 hash. Now, with NTLM version 2, you can't use this hash and pass the hash, but what you can do is crack this password offline, which is exactly what we'll do. Now, to crack this password, we're going to use hashcat. So essentially what you do is you copy and paste that NTLM hash into a new text file, and I called it dhash.txt, and you run hashcat against that text file. So let's do that. And since I've actually already cracked this hash before, it's done immediately, and I can just now show you guys the cracked hash. And here it is. The cracked password is bears !123. Okay, so now that we got valid credentials of a user from this workstation, what we can try to do is authenticate to that workstation. But first, in order to figure out how we'll do that, we'll do nmap, and we'll run this on the workstation IP. get a sense for what ports are open, what we could do. And there's a lot less ports open on this workstation than there are on the domain controller. But since port 445 is open server message block, we can use this pen testing tool in Kali called CrackMap, which will allow us to use those credentials to try to authenticate to the machine. So let's do that. I'm going to do CrackMap SMB with the IP address, the user, Dwight root, with the password we just got. We're going to click enter. And so we can authenticate with the workstation, but because this is Dwight's just a regular user on the workstation, he's not, a local admin or a domain admin, we can't remotely execute commands. But what we can do is use his credentials, and even though he's just a regular user, we'll use his credentials to enumerate the domain on the domain controller. So we're going to use a tool called LDAP domain dump -u the domain, and our domain is called deandomain.local. Oops, and we actually have to do -r with the IP address for the domain controller. Okay, we got an error earlier. Let me try running this again. Ah, I see. We need a space right there. 192.168.1-100. Now, entering that is going to create a dump, and it's going to give us a lot of information about the domain. So let's have a look at that. Right here, for example, if we go to domainusers.html, it gives us all of the users in the domain. And what I did with this is, if we already have a password, bears !123, I'm going to create a password spray with all of these usernames and see if bears !123 is used anywhere else in this environment, which would give us another angle. So I created an executable called spray.sh, and essentially how this executable works is I've got the target IP range, which is going to target my domain controller, the workstation component server, all the machines. It's going to use the password bears !123, and then I made two separate text files, one for all of the domain users and then one for all of the local users, and then it's going to use CrackMap over port 445 to authenticate with each combination to see if we have a match. So let's run this executable, spray.sh. We're going to spray all of those accounts, first with the domain accounts, and this is going to create a lot of failed logon logs, which we'll see on Splunk later. Okay, now it's doing the local accounts. We got lucky at the end because it looks like we just got access, we got a match with a local administrator account on the component server. Now, what I'm hoping for with this component server is that a domain admin logged on recently, and what we can do if that's the case is dump lsas.exe and get the domain admin's NTLM hash from that to use and pass the hash to get on the domain controller. So to dump lsas, what I'm going to do with CrackMap first is enable a firewall rule to allow RDP onto the components server using the credentials that we just got for the local admin. So I've actually got something that I'm just going to copy and paste here. It's the clipboard. right? And this is going to enable the firewall rule for RDP, and that should give us the ability to log on and dump LSAS. So we're going to run this. Okay, so good news, the command executed. And now what we can do is RDP using xRDP, xfree RDP. And we're going to do this to the component server. So give it the IP address, the user, and the password. All right, and here's our RDP session. We were just here earlier with Splunk, but essentially, I first need to disable Windows security. And now, if we go to Task Manager, we can get a dump file for LSAS. So I'll go to Create Dump File, open in the file location, and now I'm going to send this file over to my Kali machine. Okay, so now with this lsas.dmp file on my Kali machine, I'm going to use a tool called Cyberattacks to extract the NTLM hashes of any users that, were on the component server recently. So to do that, first going to change to my desktop where the file is, and we're going to do Cyberattacks. Let's say mini dump, and then the name of the file. So it just dumped all of the credentials for any of the users that were on the component server. And right here, we've got something promising, a username of domain admin test. Now, if you remember, a domain admin is really what I'm looking for because I want to get on that domain controller. So domain admin test here, and their NTLM hash, which I can use in a pass the hash to get on the domain controller. So let's go do that. I'm going to use CrackMap to do this pass the hash to get on the domain controller. And it's cool because you don't actually need the password. You can use the hash if it's available. So what I'm going to do first of all is copy this NTLM hash. And then I'm going to do CrackMap SMB192 IP address for our domain controller with the user domain admin test with the hash this time, which I will include here. Hit enter, the moment of truth. Right here, okay, this is great news because we authenticated, and this tag right here symbolizes that we can remotely execute commands to the domain controller with this account that we got. This is most likely a domain admin. So I want to create a shell to remotely execute commands on the domain controller. And so what I'm going to try to do with CrackMap is enable Windows remote management, which will create a pretty cool shell for us on the domain controller. And then after that, I'm going to create a backdoor user to establish persistence so that we don't have to keep using this legitimate account to access the domain controller. So I'll do CrackMap. Actually do that, but then we need to add our command. Okay, and our command here that I'll just copy in. And this will enable on the firewall Windows remote management. Okay, and good news, our command executed. And now we should be able to use a tool called Evil Windows Remote Management within Kali to connect to the domain controller over Windows Remote Management. So we'll do Evil Windows Remote Management -I, the IP address. And then the hash. And we have made it to the domain controller. We can verify that we're on there with who am I. Here we are, Dean domain with domain admin test. And to create that backdoor account, I'm going to do net user svc Dean domain. And the reason I'm calling it svc_Dean domain is I want to make this look like, you know, it could be a legitimate account, nothing too suspicious, right? It's just a service account. And I'll give it a password, something like backdoors 123 and -add. So the command completed successfully, and now we can exit here. Click yes. Okay, so I just realized we didn't put that backdoor account in the local administrators group, which is very important. So I'm going to do that real quick. We're going to say net local group administrators domain -add. That completed successfully, and now we can exit and then log back in through Evil Windows Remote Management with the backdoor account. So we'll do Evil 92.168-1-100 u svc_Dean domain, and then the password this time, we don't need a hash, backdoors 123. And now we are on the domain controller with our backdoor account. Okay, now we're done with the attack, and basically, let's just say that attack wasn't the quietest it could have been. A lot of what I did, specifically, you know, the password spraying and logging on to the component server with RDP, that stuff is very loud, and in Splunk, you can figure out, you know, just by looking for event code, you know, 4625, which is a failed logon, you can see that pretty easily, and you can figure out what's going on. For example, in the last 24 hours, we can see all of these failed logons, right? That didn't work. We can see right here the source network address of the Kali machine, and you can kind of follow the whole cyber attack along from there. Similarly, you could do, you know, to spot RDP logons, logon type 10 with event code 4624. That'll show up pretty easily, and you can tell, you know, someone RDP to the computer that wasn't supposed to with the administrator credentials that were taken from that IP address. Now I went ahead and made a dashboard just to kind of walk through every step that the attacker took, called it Cyber Incident. Okay, so now that it's loaded, this is the dashboard that I made for the actual cyber incident. And this loads with all the logs that I added for each little panel. First up, the first bit of activity that was unusual was this account Dwight Schrute enumerating the domain controller. If you remember, he got all of the usernames that were on the domain controller, and we have instances of that happening. Next up was that password spray, and you can, use event code 4625. There's a whole bunch of password spraying. You can see he enumerated the domain and then did a password spray. And then on the firewall, RDP was enabled. We can capture that in the event logs and see that in Splunk. You can see, again, I showed with logon type 10 for event code 4624, RDP with the local administrator onto the component server. We can see that log. We can see the attacker disabling Windows Defender. We can see that shortly after there was activity on the domain controller firewall to allow Windows remote management. There's a log for the backdoor user that was added. This is super important to make sure we can stop the attacker's persistence method. And then we can see as well that that backdoor account was added to the local administrators group. So there's no hiding from, what that attacker did. Now, what's cool about Splunk and how it works is that there's I have it so that on the component server, it's this is where Splunk Enterprise is hosted, but on all the other devices like the domain controller and the workstation, I have what are called forwarders sending logs over to Splunk, and you get to determine, hey, do I want to send my security logs over? Do I want to send my system logs over? Do I want to send application setup, etc.? And you set that up through inputs. And so, for example, what I decided to do and how I got my logs is I got the forwarders to send over all of the application logs, all of the security logs, all the system logs, and then also additionally the logs for Windows Defender, since attackers tend to change settings on that as well. And yeah, so Splunk has been super cool. I've enjoyed using it. There's certainly a lot more that I have to learn through practicing with sim tools, but yeah, this was a super positive experience. And thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Thank you.